So thank you for coming. I'm delighted to be here. I want to talk to you today about mythology and Greek art. And this is an area that I've worked on quite a lot, actually more on the Roman side. I wrote a book on the use of Greek myths in Roman art, but it's something I teach on quite a bit in my courses at Warwick. And I'm really interested, I guess, in the different meanings of mythological stories in art and how they were used for different purposes. So what I want to do today is just take you through some of the different ways you can represent mythology in art, and some of the different reasons why states, in particular, we're looking today at cities, might have chosen to do that. And we're going to do that through looking at three main monuments. The Parthenon in Athens, which you can see on the first screen, the Great Altar from Pergamum, which dates to the 2nd century BC from the Hellenistic period, and the theatre at Hierapolis, which dates from the Roman period. So what I'm hoping to do as well is to give you both a sense of the different ways that stories are told in art and the reasons why, and also how that sort of changes over time as well. So I suppose the first thing to think about is, what is a myth? How do we interpret myths? What do we mean when we say a myth? And I guess there's a difference here between what we might think of in terms of modern myths and ancient myths. So modern myths, it's often something that's not true. We talk about urban myths and things like that, which are usually sort of apocryphal stories that circulate but are not actually factually true. Then we also talk about kind of myths and legends, or folk tales, fairy tales, those kind of stories which are maybe sometimes associated with other sorts of beings, so kind of fairy tales or stories about goblins and things like that, or folk tales which in some ways often have embedded in them cautionary tales, things like Little Red Riding Hood, you know, don't stray off the road and talk to strangers, those sorts of tales which have a kind of a moral in them. And I think some of those are related to ancient Greek myths as well. You can see some of those aspects in ancient myths. Legends in modern parlance, I guess when we talk about a legend, we mean something that kind of we think has a kernel of historical accuracy, but has been embellished over time. So something like the Arthurian legend. And again, that's appropriate when we're thinking about ancient Greek myths, because a number of those myths, for example, things like the Trojan War, we think there is a sort of kernel of truth to it, but that's been changed over time and lots of different stories have arisen. But in the ancient Greek conception of myth, they had a distinction made between mythos, which meant something spoken, and logos, which meant something written. So the oral tradition is really important for myth in terms of the derivation of the word. It's a story really that gets told and retold. And this is one of the beautiful and occasionally frustrating things about Greek myths, that they can be retold in lots of different ways. So often the details of the characters' names change, or precisely what they did, who they were, who their parents were, things like that. Names of family members and stuff can change quite a lot in different readings, or even you can have two variants of the same myth. So for example, the story of Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, we have two retellings of the myth by the tragedian Euripides, one where she gets sacrificed to Aulis in order to have a passage for the Greeks to get to Troy, the other one in which she's sort of rescued at the last minute by Artemis and goes off to be a priestess in Taurus. So there's lots of flexibility in the ancient world for people to rewrite myths as well. And I guess that's partly kind of makes things more complicated for us as historians, because you don't always know when you're looking at an image which version of the myth it is that they're presenting. So there must have been lots of these versions of myths that we don't necessarily have anymore. But I suppose these are two potential interpretations of myths which I think are useful. The one is that it's an oft repeated story, which everyone knows, that conveys essential truths about life, the human condition, the relationship between gods and mortals. And this is particularly important for a lot of Greek myths, that they have the gods involved. So that they are stories about people, but often about people in relations to the gods. And they can also be used to affirm a shared set of beliefs, to explain something, to explain why things are the way they are. So sometimes that's to give you a reason for something, a kind of creation myth, but they can also offer warnings and models for human life in the same way that we see sort of folk tales doing. If we're thinking about how do you tell stories in art, then there are two main ways of doing this. There's what's known as the synoptic view, which is essentially a snapshot view of an entire, of a single moment in a particular myth, which then you kind of read out from to think about the myth more generally. So there's a very good example of this. I'm mostly going to be focusing on architectural sculpture today, but this is one of my few vases. As a very good example of this on the Exekias amphora in the British Museum, where we've got Achilles killing Penthesilea. And the story here is that they meet at Troy, Achilles kills Penthesilea, but falls in love with her at the very moment that he's killing her. And that's encapsulated in this image by the eye contact between the two figures. But also we're helped to know who these figures are by things like the iconography, so the way that they're represented, the fact that they're both wearing armor. So this is that they're both warriors, but the fact that this figure here has white or light colored skin, which is a artistic convention in Greek art for showing female figures, the idea being that women stay indoors and therefore don't get suntanned, whereas men are outdoors, so much darker skin. So here you've got this kind of contrast between Achilles, who's in the black figure, and then Penthesilea, where they've added white to kind of lighten her skin. So she's a female figure and she's wearing armor, which identifies her as being an Amazon. And then we have extra information provided here by the name labels, where we've got Achilles' name and Penthesilea's name. So this sort of encapsulates the whole story in one snapshot synoptic moment. The other way of doing it is to give you what are known as diaconic images, which are images of different episodes in time, one after the other. And we find this quite a lot on Metaphase, for example. So on the left, you've got a drawing of the Metaphase from the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, where we have all the different stories of Heracles' labours. The 12 labours of Heracles fit quite nicely onto Metaphase. At Olympia, we've got 6 at the front, 6 at the back. I seem to have lost my Y here on the bottom of the screenshot of the screen. And you also find it later as well in things like Roman sarcophagi, so where you get these different episodes. Sometimes you have the sort of the change over time as Heracles gets older, so we start off with him being beardless, and then in the later scenes he's bearded. So that again conveys a sense of a story, a sense of narrative. But what I want to focus on mostly in this talk is how myths are represented in architectural sculpture. And we're going to talk first about a temple, the Parthenon, and then about an altar and a theatre. So if you're thinking about kind of the placement of sculpture on temples, there are 3 main places in which we find it. In the pediments, which you can just about see in these snapshots of the Ionic order and the Doric order. So you can have freestanding sculptures set into the pediments. You can have relief sculpture set into decorating the frieze, particularly in the Ionic order. And then on the Doric order, where we have metaphors and triglyphs, so the metaphors are the square panels, which often, not always, but often have figural decoration, and the triglyphs are these sort of 3 verticals. We can have figural scenes on the metaphors. So this is what we see at the Parthenon, where in fact, as you probably know, we have the interesting feature of a combination of metaphors and triglyphs and also an Ionic frieze. So in the Parthenon, what I want to suggest is that myths are being used for 3 reasons. 1, to praise the goddess that the temple is in honor of. 1, to create a sense of kind of civic identity for Athens. And the other one is a metaphor for Athenian achievements of the time. So the Parthenon was built between 447 and 432 as part of the Periclean building program, which, well, Pericles is general of Athens, by architects Iktinos and Callicrates under, we think, the sort of overall artistic vision of the sculptor Phidias, who also does the makes the famous chryselephantine statue in the center of the Parthenon. So this is a time when Athens is really at the height of her powers. She is head of the Delian League, which is a union of Greek states, originally set up in the aftermath of the Persian Wars, as in order to sort of defend Greece against the Persians, but later, which becomes really the Athenian Empire. So the member states pay tribute to the Athenians, first in ships and then later in money. And this money is used much of Pericles' building program. So it's sort of, it's a statement of piety to the goddess Artemis, Athena rather, but it's also very much a statement of kind of power and prestige as well. So on the Parthenon, we have myths in three different areas. So we have myths represented on the pediments at the east and west sides, the birth of Athena on the east, and the contest between Athena and Poseidon on the west. And then we have myths represented on all four sides of the temple on the Metaphase, with these different scenes, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. We don't have any, well, depending on how you interpret the Panathinaike frieze, the frieze, we probably don't have myths on the frieze. So I sort of ascribe to the interpretation of the frieze that it is a representation of the Panathinaike procession in honour of Athena, rather than that it's a mythological scene, which has been argued by Joy Connolly. But we do have more myths on the statue of the Athena Parthenos in the centre of the temple. So just to go through those, we have the birth of Athena on the east pediment. So this is a reconstruction based on the drawings made by Jacques Carré in the 17th, 18th century. I've got to put the date down. And most of the trouble with the pediments is that we've actually lost the middle of most of them, but we do have obviously various sculptures now in the British Museum. So here we have kind of Athena springing up just after she's been born from Zeus. So this is very much about her origins and honouring her as a kind of important goddess and as daughter of Zeus, being crowned by the little figure of Nike here in the middle. And then we have all of the gods kind of in attendance watching on. And then on the western pediment, we have a scene which particularly relates to Athens. So this is the contest between Athena and the god Poseidon for control of Attica, which Athena wins. And we have her olive tree represented in the background between the two figures here. So this again sort of symbolises that connection between Athena and the city of Athens itself. Again, we don't have the two central figures. We do have part of the torso of Poseidon, but we have these other figures which come from the pediments. So probably on the left, Ilyssos, the river god, and the messenger goddess Iris here on the right. So you can see how the pediments are kind of praising the goddess, identifying the temple as being dedicated to her, her home for her cult statue, and also tying it in with Athens as well. But in many ways, I think it's the Metaphase that are actually more interesting. So here we have four different scenes represented. Only the south ones, the Centromachy ones, are in good condition, but we know of the others from the evidence that survives. So we've got the Amazonomachy, battle of the Greeks against the Amazons. We've got the Gigantomachy, the battle of the gods against the giants. We've got the sack of Troy, the battle of the Greeks against the against the Trojans. And we've got the Centromachy, the battle of the Lapis against the centaurs. So this is one of the Centromachy Metaphase, which is, these are particularly well preserved. And then we've got a few bits and pieces of the others as well. So these are the two of the Gigantomachy, which are in the Acropolis Museum in Athens, but you can see they've been much more damaged. But why these four myths? Why these particular scenes? And, you know, essentially the thing that ties all of these myths together is the idea of a force which is aligned with the Greeks, which the Athenians are sort of aligning themselves with, against an other. Whether that's the centaurs, who are sort of half man, half beast, the giants, who are again sort of bestial. They're not, they're often shown in later art with sort of giant snake legs and things like that as being not fully humanoid, and where the gods win. the Greeks against the Trojans, where again you're supposed to see yourself as being on the Greek side, and the Athenians against the Amazons, where again you're on the Greek side. So all of them are kind of tributes to the idea of civilization against barbarianism or barbarism, or sort of Greeks against others, in which it's very much the Greeks who are coming out on top, and with whom Athens is associating herself. And so the common reading of these myths is that they are a way for Athens to talk about her recent successes and her prestige. So particularly to kind of hark back to the Greek version, Greek victory over the Persians at Marathon and Plataea and all the rest of it earlier on at Salamis, and the beginning of the 5th century BC, but also to sort of maybe send a kind of statement that they are the people who represent kind of Greek hegemony, Greek leadership at this period. And this is important, as we'll see a little bit later, because it gets picked up on again in the great altar at Pergamon. On the statue of the Athena Parthenos, we've got Pausanias's description. We haven't got the original statue, but we've got Roman sort of smaller scale replicas of it, like the one you see in the middle here. And we've also, on the left, is the reconstruction they made for the reconstruction of the Parthenon at Nashville, which shows the sort of the scale of it. If you ever come to any of Warwick Classics Network events, we have some virtual reality cameras as well, with a sort of virtual reality tour of Athens, where you can kind of zoom in and look at the Athena Parthenos, which is great fun. So this is obviously conveying the might of the goddess Athena, but also these myths are also represented on it. So on the base we have the myth of the birth of Pandora, and then particularly I wanted to talk about here the shield. So on the shield we know from Pliny that it had the Amazonomachy on the back, on the outside, and then on the inside again the Gigantomachy, the battle of the gods against the giants. And the Centauromachy, which also features on the Metaphase, was represented on the sandals of the statue. So you've got this kind of echoing of themes from the outside of the temple on the Metaphase, finding them again inside the temple on the statue of Athena itself. So why, what do these themes mean? Well, the battle of the gods against the giants is something that we find on lots of different religious buildings. So I think it is there, you can see it both as a metaphor for kind of good against evil, for the defeat of barbarianism, but also as a kind of tribute to the gods and their power. So for example, you see it on the Siphian treasury at Delphi, which in the 6th century BC, and also earlier on the Athenian Acropolis, on the older temple of Athena, which was a sort of precursor to the Parthenon. So here, these are again in the Acropolis Museum in Athens. You've got Athena with her aegis, her sort of snake, kind of lined aegis, and the snake sort of coming out of it here, and then a fallen giant that she's attacking.